Just explain why you think this is essential at this moment and how likely a bill of this sort is to pass.
You know, I started this effort a couple of years ago, long before we had any idea who the 45th President of the United States would be or who either party's nominee would be. I introduced this legislation over a year ago, the Global Trade Accountability Act, with an eye toward having Congress reclaim its authority. Congress is constitutionally empowered to set tariffs and import duties and things like that to decide trade policy questions, and Congress needs to exercise that power. Over the last 90 years, Congress has been steadily delegating out that power to the chief executive, and the action announced by the president last week, which many in Congress are very uncomfortable with, is a great example of why Congress should be exercising this power in the first place rather than the executive branch.
You're saying this is the president abusing that power?
I think the power itself has been excessively delegated. I think it is a mistake to use Section 232 in the manner that he's prescribed. I think it's going to end up harming American workers and harming American consumers. Disproportionately, this cost will be borne on America's poor and middle class. But the fact that it's being exercised at all should be a wake-up call for us and should be a reason why we can't pass a reform like the Global Trade Accountability Act.
I hear what you're saying, but one could make the argument that Congress hasn't exactly proved its mettle. It's not capable of getting a lot of work done, the tax bill notwithstanding, that a lot of things get gummed up in the works. And in fact, when that power lies in the executive branch, things can get done. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, my response to that is great. If that means that keeps us away from a trade war, then fantastic. It is supposed to be difficult to take steps that bring about a trade war, that kill jobs, that kill livelihoods. We should be cautious about that, and that's one of the reasons why we ought to pass this legislation. We want to make it more difficult to start a trade war.
Senator, under what conditions, if any, are tariffs a good idea?
Okay, there are several categories identified by my bill that would allow the president temporary authority to use his executive authority unilaterally in instances of national security, for example, but would then put a 90-day limit, a 90-day shot clock on the exercise of that authority so that it would be kicked back for Congress. In some instances, there are many people who argue that there are certain national security reasons why the United States might, in some cases, want to impose tariffs. I understand that, and that's often the justification put forward for an exercise of 232 authority. But that's not present here. I mean, look, our national security needs can be satisfied by about 3% of the steel we use in a year, and we produce about 80% of the steel that we need in the United States for all purposes right here in our own country.
Senator, are those that look at this and say this was an obvious move by the president? He's fulfilling a campaign promise. He's effectively buying the votes of these individuals ahead of the midterms. Do you think ultimately, given all the costs that you've described here as a result of these tariffs, this will actually be a vote-losing strategy if indeed he follows through?
Look, I have no doubt but that some people might be rejoicing over this decision. This might shore up some jobs in the United States. And I understand that, but the number of jobs put at risk far outnumber those jobs. The American consumer and the American worker, on the whole, will be harmed by this action more than anyone will be helped by this action. That's one of the reasons why I think we ought to consider it. And we ought to reconsider this. We ought to pass reforms that will bring this back to the Article I branch, the People's branch. And it's also one of the reasons why we ought to consider doing what the Congress did in response to Jimmy Carter's action under Section 232 in 1980. Congress decided to override his decision and, in fact, overrode a presidential veto to that effect.
Senator, I want to take a bit of a hard turn here just to another issue that I know you are passionate about. You recently wrote an op-ed along with Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Chris Murphy regarding U.S. involvement in Yemen by way of supporting the Saudi efforts there in that conflict. You three suggesting that we should withdraw that support in that particular conflict, both for humanitarian and other reasons. Have you found support for that? And I'm curious, then, what is the next step if indeed we withdraw that support in the ongoing humanitarian crisis that's happening there?
My view is that we shouldn't be fighting in a war that Congress hasn't authorized. There is a shared power at stake here. On the one hand, the President of the United States is empowered as our commander-in-chief. On the other hand, Congress has the power to declare war. At some point, at certain levels, those two powers can overlap a little bit. But we are involved and have been involved since 2015 in a civil war in Yemen. We've been assisting the coalition led by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in active involvement as a co-belligerent in that conflict. That's the kind of thing that the Constitution requires Congress to authorize. And so short of that authorization, there should be no involvement. And that's what I'm calling for. That's why I want us out of that conflict. It's not our war unless or until such time as Congress declares it such.